All right. Good morning, noon, and night, everyone, wherever and whenever you are listening to The Shift. I am your host, Doug McKenty. This is the June 28th, 2017 edition. I want to thank everybody for listening. If you're interested, please check out my Patreon account. Try to help out, up the production value, and keep The Shift going here at patreon.com/backslash The Shift. You can also get in touch with me on Facebook at The Shift with Doug McKenty, or join the conversation on Twitter at DMcKenty. So if you like what you're listening to, then let's make the community larger and keep the conversation going. All right. Well, my guest for today is Will Parrish. Will Parrish is an award-winning investigative journalist. He has been living and working in Northern California for most of his life, focusing on environmental and military issues. He seeks to challenge conventional wisdom, expose wrongdoing by the wielders of political and institutional power, and tell stories of people struggling for environmental and social justice. Will's work has been showcased locally in Northern California in the East Bay Express and North Bay Bohemian, as well as featured in well-known news outlets such as Alternet, Counterpunch, Truth Out, and recently in a 4-part series soon to be expanded upon with The Intercept, entitled TigerSwan Tactics, about what was going on at Standing Rock. Hey, Will, how's it going?
Oh, it's going pretty good. Just finished part 5 of that series, and talking to you is the first thing I'm doing after completing that draft. So thanks for having me on.
Good. Yeah, I've been following your work for a number of years since we're both here in Northern California, and I was really happy to see that you've managed to kind of go national or even international with The Intercept. What a great news organization that Glenn Greenwald and Jeremy Scahill have going on there. So it was nice to see somebody from our area kind of starting to hit the big time there. So happy for you for that.
Thank you.
I just wanted to start off, well, why don't we talk a little bit, because I know about your activism as well, and some of the stuff that was going on with the Willits bypass here locally. I just wanted to start off with a conversation about, well, I mean, where you are as an investigative journalist, but also, this concept of activist journalism, because so many people, I think, these days want to shy away from that. They're trying to be very objective. But I think that your work is very politically motivated, which I appreciate. So I kind of wanted to get into, where you are on that. Maybe give a little bit of the story about what was going on with the Willits bypass. It was such a local issue. And then, just expand on the kind of journalism that you're doing right now.
Sure. Well, the Trump administration's kind of aggressive assault against journalism has really opened up that conversation, right? I mean, I just happened to be browsing Politico of all things yesterday, and there was an article that was among the most read articles of the day, entitled something like, the idea of neutrality in journalism is dead. Good riddance. Which this is appearing at Politico, so it's kind of like, clearly this is something that is alive in the mainstream media right now. So, I've always seen my journalism as an extension of my political beliefs and political goals, and vice versa. I work for various political goals through means other than journalism, or at least I have throughout pretty much my entire adult life. I believe in advocacy journalism, and I believe that the idea of neutrality is so often used as a mask to actually serve powerful interests. I think the idea of professional objective journalism sort of came about, in correspondence with the rise of corporate journalism in the United States. So, I've always seen journalism as a political tool. I think that it inherently is a political tool, whether that's recognized or not. I have no qualms around doing advocacy journalism. At various times in my life, I've been more active doing journalism. At various times, I've done things like climb, trees and wick drain stitchers, and written about those experiences. At this point, I'm more focused on journalism and reporting. I think that The Intercept is a great outlet for what I have done, because more than anyone, I think Glenn Greenwald, one of the founders of The Intercept, has advanced a certain kind of advocacy journalism in recent years. So, I feel like I'm in a good place to focus on journalism right now, but definitely, I'm proud of other things I've done. I don't shy away from having done things like, you know, taken on the Wilkes bypass and gotten arrested for it and things like that.
Right. I mean, they've called journalists in the past the fourth estate, meaning that it's the function in a democratic society that we have journalists that are actually out there fighting corruption. And if all you're doing, I really like what you said about sort of neutral or objective journalism being an excuse put out by powerful interests or corporate interests as a way of saying, as a way of justifying their position, and sort of pushing aside those who are seeking to just expose the corruption within the system. I mean, this is a serious issue. So, I mean, let's talk about things have gotten so cloudy in the last 6 months with Donald Trump. I mean, he has come out in some ways, he's come out against, is he against journalism or against the mainstream media? We've had this whole Russian thing happening. And now we've had a couple of journalists at CNN who have had to resign over pushing this Russia situation for the ratings instead of actually seeking out the truth. We've had this meme that's coming out about fake news, which I have a tendency to think is a way of drowning out dissident voices sometimes. There's just a fine line. I mean, as an independent journalist, what are your feelings surrounding all of this, like this whole atmosphere that's going on right now?
Yeah, I mean, the Russia thing has, I think, had an interesting effect just in my own little realm of journalism, which, is obviously, sort of a very small slice of journalism, reporting for alternative news outlets and publications like The Intercept. I mean, the Russia narrative has been sort of like the meta narrative that journalists seem to be encouraged to tie everything into as much as possible lately, and people who do that to some degree, they get more readership, they get more attention. There's a big incentive to play into narratives like that, and it's not something that's new per se. I mean, anytime that there's a big boogeyman kind of national enemy that gets defined in people's minds, there's a huge incentive for journalists to tie their stories into that larger narrative, and that makes it harder for stories that don't fit that narrative to get attention or to be taken seriously. So I would say, for example, in my own experience, trying to push these stories out about DAPL private security mercenaries being a part of these massive police operations against political protesters, I think has big implications for people's First Amendment rights. It has big implications for the kind of policing that happens in the United States. And, I think the stories have gotten a lot of attention, but, and maybe I'm biased, because I happen to be working on them, but I think it's an important story. And I think it is one example of many of major stories that are happening that maybe don't get the attention they deserve because they don't fit that bigger narrative that is prevalent in the corporate press. And if, I don't know how you feel about the Russia thing and the actual substance to the allegations against Trump. I think there's probably something there, and there's interesting things that merit reporting, but it's become such an obsession, I think, of so many people. And in a situation where a story is getting so much play, I think it always behooves people to examine what interest that story is serving.
Right.
And there's various interests that are being served by that story. I think that there's a lot of uncritical acceptance of the intelligence community, as it's called, that are pushing that story. And that's one of the things that I would like to see a lot more people questioning as these stories come out. And I'm saying that as someone who is very strongly anti-Trump, et cetera, of course.
I almost find it interesting because I don't like to come across as a Trump supporter either. But at the same time, I've found that exactly what you're talking about. The Russian narrative is starting to take, it's starting to be almost a diversion from other, maybe more important issues. And it is taking the intel, which I think all Americans should have a healthy distrust of the intelligence agencies, the NSA, the CIA. I mean, why are we believing these guys? It could just be as much American propaganda as Russian propaganda, right? I mean, when these intelligence agencies are just telling you what to do, and then you have reporters, from the corporate media, unquestioningly reporting this stuff without getting any kind of, without doing any kind of investigative journalism, really, just quoting these official government narratives as if they're fact. I don't know that that's really doing the job. So,
sure.
I guess maybe just if you could say a few more words about the corporate press, in that I think it is heavily influenced. It's heavily influenced by getting ratings. It's heavily influenced by the commercialism, the fact that it's sponsored by these corporate commercials. And is it really doing the same kind of a job that someone like you as an independent journalist can do?
Right. Well, as you're alluding to, these are big businesses. Their business model is basically to sell viewers or readers to their advertisers because they're making most of their money through advertising. It's a profit-oriented model. And so if there is a situation such as with Russia where people are avidly consuming that story way, that model feeds in, that model just encourages the reporters who are reporting these stories just feed more and more of that narrative to this audience that they're then selling back to their advertisers and bumping up their profits. And, of course, a big crisis, I think, a moment that last year was when I believe it was the president of NBC News or an owner of NBC News said that, talked about how Trump's presidency has been so great for ratings and, just advocating for more Trump, which clearly you have this dangerous, fascist style autocratic campaign happening, the Trump campaign. And you have one of the major news outlets in the United States talking about how great that is for business. So, pointing to a, sort of dangerous convergence of the profit motives of the corporate press and a dangerous political movement that, threatens the liberties of people in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. I heard that the corporate press made $100 million more this election cycle than any other election cycle in history, because even though it was almost entirely bad press about Trump, he got such high ratings that they kept feeding him. And then I think the statistic actually was he got $1 billion. His campaign got $1 billion worth of free press from the corporate media, just because, even though it was bad press, they say there's no such thing as bad press. He got all the name recognition in the world for free. And then, the corporate news agencies got $100 million for it. So it's not a very functional democracy when you look at it from that perspective.
Right. And, I think a lot of the things that we're talking about, more people are realizing the press has lost a lot of credibility. I think that Trump's presidency is a reflection of that. The fact that he feels like winning political strategy is to campaign against the media. In the United Kingdom, it was a big deal that Jeremy Corbyn's campaign did so well, despite having the entire media lined up against him. And he's coming from a different place politically completely than Donald Trump. So, across the spectrum, I think that there's a total loss of credibility right now that has historic implications, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes.
For sure. I mean, I think the important thing, actually, just sitting here thinking about it, is that the consuming public has to become more critical. There are, which is one of the reasons why, and I'm so glad that you decided to be on the program, because trying to showcase more independent journalists. And then as you're consuming, people who are listening to this, please, as you're consuming the mass of information that's out there on the internet, you just have to have a critical eye, but you can pick out the good from the bad. Follow a few sources, make sure that people are doing good work. But I mean, why don't you actually say a little something about that? I mean, do you find, say, fake news sources, or are you seeing a lot of swag out on the internet that's really not worth it? Or how do you discern between good journalism and bad journalism that's out there right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I sort of just put my head down and focus on my own work, and
Right.
try to read good sources. And there is a lot of great journalism on the internet. Obviously, there's a lot of crap, and
Right.
I mean, my own approach is to try to ignore things that I don't find to be worth my time and energy. That's just how I personally approach it. I think that clearly there is a lot of bad information on the internet, and in a sense, I think that the corporate media has promoted that idea, and in doing that, sort of promoted uncritical acceptance of their own reporting. And just as often, I think that there's a problem with really bad reporting in the corporate media. Like I came of age politically, in a sense, as the Iraq War was gearing up in 2002, 2003.
Sure.
And that's sort of the earliest time I remember really critically analyzing media coverage, like with a lot of scrutiny. And there's so many completely ridiculous fake news, if you will, stories about Iraq having weapons of mass destruction. There was a big propaganda campaign that drove American public opinion about Iraq completely off the spectrum, and the rest of the world was looking at the United States wondering, what the hell is going on with people in the United States, that they're believing that Iraq is this big security threat. Even Kuwait, which was invaded by Iraq in 1990, did not see Iraq as a security threat, and the U.S. did, and that was because of horrible media coverage of that story. So this is a longstanding issue, and I think that the internet has a lot of pros and cons, and one thing that it does do is it affords people like me more of an opportunity to get our stories out without the gatekeepers of the corporate press preventing those stories from getting out. At the same time, there's a lot more sort of tribalism of a sort, where people are just consuming stories that confirm their existing biases. You have a lot of stories that are totally unvetted and not fact checked or purposely false. So,
Right.
I mean, one thing that in our reporting just on this series on TigerSwan and the police operation in North Dakota found was that TigerSwan has a fake news operation going on the internet, where they create fake Facebook pages. They feed stories to fake websites. By fake websites, I mean they're posing as news outlets, but they're actually corporate propaganda for this oil corporation.
Right.
And you would have to because it's online. It's clearly suspicious material, but you would have to do a lot of digging, as we've done, to actually figure out that it is TigerSwan putting these stories out there. So, these things are more and more a part of corporate propaganda strategies and government propaganda strategies, I feel. So, I feel like the internet has a very complicated impact on people's ability to consume accurate news or news with public value. It's just a big mixed bag.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a great segue into this Intercept article then. What got you involved with the Intercept? How did you get your hands on these documents? So you got these leaked documents from somebody who worked for TigerSwan. Did those go through the Intercept and then get to you, or did you get your hands on them? How did you end up getting this primary information?
Well, this project started for me essentially because I paid a lot of attention to the Standing Rock story. I was sort of involved in writing about Standing Rock, and also went to Standing Rock, did some support for people from Mendocino County up there. Hello, Mendo, who went
Yeah.
out to Standing Rock. And
How long were you there?
I was there for about 9 days in November. It was the period where there was the big incident on the backwater bridge where people with water hoses amidst freezing or sub-freezing temperatures.
Okay.
So, I got to see a lot of the police operation firsthand. It clearly seemed to me to be a counterinsurgency operation that had a lot of layers to it that were sort of hard to understand fully at the time. There's clearly a lot going on behind the scenes. I mean, I think everyone recognized that about this police operation, and we knew that private security were involved. Different people knew more than I did, obviously, about that at the time. And, I just started working on a story that was originally going to be in The Nation, actually, which I, have had established a relationship with, about the federal prosecutions of Standing Rock protesters that are ongoing. And I just started by filing a lot of records requests and doing reporting and interviews. One thing led to another. I ended up with a lot of documents through records requests. The story with The Nation never materialized. And I approached The Intercept, and it turned out that, they had material that helped confirm things I was looking at. I had material that helped confirm things they were looking at. And so we created a partnership and have been publishing the material we've compiled ever since, and compiling new material. And at this point, we have, I think, 8 stories planned in this series.
Nice. And you've published 4 of those so far. Who?
That's right.
Can you talk about who you've partnered with? You've got 2 other co-authors on the story.
Right. I'm co-authoring the stories with Aline Brown and Alice Sperry, who are Intercept reporters. They're on the staff. Aline's done a lot of great work, I think, paving the way for the series through reporting on Standing Rock and reporting on the climate justice movement for The Intercept. She was actually a researcher for Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, about climate change. So that's a little bit of her background. Alice has done a lot of criminal justice report Times and other publications. So, it's been a wonderful experience working in a team on this, and I'm excited to see where it goes. It's been great.
So what do you think was, I don't know, I want to say the most shocking or the most eye-opening piece of information that you got? What you ended up with, at least what you quote extensively, are these actual documents from TigerSwan that are kind of reiterating what they were going through, what they were doing, tactical decision-making, reports
Right.
that were day-to-day, and you got your hands on a few of these, or a couple months worth of exactly what was going on there. So as you were going through them, what was the first thing that kind of struck you as to the attitude of this private contractor that was working with government agencies fighting these protesters?
What struck me the most is that they saw the Standing Rock resistance as a religiously driven insurgency, similar, with a similar lens to how, so-called jihadist fighters in military battlefields are viewed by the U.S. military. These are former special forces operatives in a lot of cases. That's who founded TigerSwan and runs TigerSwan on a day-to-day basis. So it's a striking example of the war on terrorism coming home to U.S. soil in the sense of the kinds of policing and security operations that happen in military battlefields actually, being utilized on U.S. soil. And, I think it's a model that has existed in various parts of the world, and, we're maybe not as familiar with in the U.S., but in so many cases in the global South, in countries that have resources that corporations are trying to obtain, you have these partnerships of private security and police where, the police don't really have a they aren't fully in control of the operation. The private security sort of operates above the law. And I think that, when you have companies like TigerSwan that are used to operating in that environment, operating on U.S. soil, it's very revealing, very dangerous. There were certainly some incidents where it would have been very possible for people to be killed. And, at Standing Rock, like in October, there was an incident where a private security operative came into a camp, the camps amid this police raid that was happening with a AR-15, got run off the road by protesters as he was barreling, in his truck toward one of the camps, got out brandishing his gun, aimed it at people. It was loaded. It was, people could have easily died in that situation, and that was a private security operative. Clearly, this individual had been fed a lot of information about these protesters being dangerous terrorists and acted accordingly in the situation. So, that's just an example of, I think, what's dangerous about that. But basically, TigerSwan was a part of a very sophisticated, multi-layered operation. I think we're, still in the process of making sense of everything that happened. What we're going to be reporting on in the next little while is how this relationship between private security and domestic security agencies like the FBI have worked out in federal prosecutions of activists. Actually, the first prosecution of a political dissenter occurred in the Trump administration after Donald Trump inauguration was a water protector in North Dakota named Michael Marcus. He's facing over 10 years in prison. The FBI investigated him. You've got the U.S. Attorney's Office prosecuting him. And the evidence in his case, according to the court documents I've looked at, mainly came from the private security operations helicopters that were overflying the protest sites at the time that he allegedly did the things that he's accused of. And so you have, it's from top to bottom, this merger of private interests funded by an oil corporation, this private security operation, and public law enforcement. And, to see that playing out in federal prosecutions being brought by the Trump administration, I think is something that's worth paying attention to, for everybody, because the question I think that comes out of this series is, to what degree is this a model for the future, and to what extent will these agencies and corporations learn from this and apply it in other situations?
Well, it was interesting. I was going to bring up, I was doing some research for another interview, and I saw an interview with ex-Green Party presidential candidate Cynthia McKinney. One of the things that she was explaining was that whenever they do something to the African-American community, then you can be sure they're going to be bringing it to everybody later on down the line. And it just clicked that it reminded me that this is exactly what's going on here. At Standing Rock, is they have this indigenous population. They're rolling out this new public-private fusion with these defense contractors from the war on terror, and they're applying it to the Native American community at Standing Rock. But it seems inevitable that this is basically a beta testing something that's just going to become more and more popular for anybody that has any dissenting political beliefs in the future. They're going to be able to roll this kind of stuff out, and they're going to have this history and this knowledge of how to do it, which they learned in Iraq, just like you're saying. I mean, they basically come to Standing Rock and impose this counterinsurgency, anti-terrorism protocol on top of something that's completely different, that's a non-violent political protest domestically. So I think that should be frightening to everyone.
Yeah, and in looking at that issue you raised of sort of canaries in the coal mine and these police operations targeting people of color, I recently was thinking about where else has this model happened previously, and the closest parallel I think was actually post-Hurricane New Orleans in 2005 in a sense where
Sure.
you had Blackwater mercenaries roaming the streets, working with police to, for the stated purpose of clamping down on riots and looting following this hurricane. But, in these predominantly African American areas of New Orleans, they were able to implement this public-private fusion model of security that, was sort of the original basis for Jeremy Scahill's work on Blackwater. Actually, he reported on Blackwater's presence in New Orleans after the hurricane. So, to me, that's actually probably the closest model to what we saw, just in terms of the role of private security being so central to a policing operation in the United States. It's the North Dakota governor declared a state of emergency. The National Guard was a part of this operation, and then you have this private mercenary corporation coming in and taking part in every facet of this police operation. And the fact that, as you said, people of color are the targets mainly definitely fits in an historical pattern.
Right. Maybe you could talk for a second about the Pinkertons. I know you brought them up. Just to put this in a historical context, there has been a history of this kind of corporate government fusion. I mean, this is what we're seeing on all levels in the United States, actually. This is where the fears of fascism that people discuss, I don't even necessarily, I think it's been happening in the United States since the entire post-World War II era, but it seems to be building into a head now, and we've seen it, all the way since really probably post-Civil War, and then that's when the Pinkertons kind of got started in 1890s, 1900 really. But we've seen a long history of this kind of thing. Will you discuss that just for a second?
Yeah, I'm not the most knowledgeable person about the Pinkertons, but certainly, like, on a general level, I know that they were in a way a precursor to the FBI. A lot of the personnel that formed the early Bureau of Investigation in 1913 or whatever it was, came from the Pinkertons, and they were sort of a mercenary detective and security corporation that worked on behalf of big business, for example, trying to squelch labor unrest in the coal fields of West Virginia, in places like that. I think, so it is very similar on a general level. TigerSwan, they sort of just, they operated above the law in so many ways, and operated in a manner that, really resembles my understanding of how the Pinkertons operated, because you'd basically have these mercenaries for hire whose function was to, by any means necessary, repress a political movement that was challenging corporate power.
Right.
So these guys had no standards that I'm aware of they're operating under, at least with the FBI or police. There are technically legal guidelines that they operate under. They are technically accountable to the tax-paying public, to governing bodies. And one of the things that we found in researching these stories is that there are these gaping legal loopholes where there's very little accountability for corporations like this. One interesting thing, which I'm not sure if you would be aware of at this point because it's sort of gotten marginal media coverage so far, but we're focusing on it in the next installment of our series, is that actually TigerSwan, I think honestly, as a result of our stories, now faces a civil and criminal complaint by the North Dakota Private Security Investigative Board. They've had misdemeanor charges filed against them for operating without a license, using the documents we published as exhibits in this complaint. So, but the interesting thing I think there is that this is a misdemeanor Class B charge, right, that has carries a maximum sentence for the founder of TigerSwan of 1 month in prison, which it's very unlikely that he'll do any jail time for this. I would guess that there might be a fine or perhaps a restraining order that prevents them from legally operating in North Dakota. But contrast that with over 700 people facing criminal charges for opposing the pipeline, some of whom face potentially decades in prison. So
Wow.
I think that that's while there is a little bit of accountability now for TigerSwan, it is a pretty powerful indictment, I think, of our legal system that they, at worst, face a month in prison. Their founder does. While the people that were targeted by this police operation, many of whom, they have their charges are completely trumped up.
Sure.
That's me being a non-objective journalist saying that. They face years in prison potentially. So it's obviously in certain ways we have not come very far since the Pinkerton days.
Sure. I mean, I think that this is the key, right? I mean, these companies can hire these private security agencies, and like you're saying, they basically can operate with impunity. They have laws that protect them as private corporations, whereas the police actually are restrained in what they do because, theoretically the public is watching them. They have accountability to and the sheriffs usually get elected, so it's like ultimately to the people. They can't just do whatever they want. One of the things you were saying in the article was that every time TigerSwan showed up, they would start to advocate to local law enforcement to start using harsher and harsher methods. Like, oh, you guys
Right.
are being too soft on these protesters. You need to be harder, more hardcore.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, some of the documents that we got that were leaked talk about there's basically an assessment of how well Iowa county sheriffs are doing safeguarding the interests of of Energy Transfer Partners, the company building the pipeline, and they talk about 3 different county sheriffs offices in Iowa that they want to try to get to use harsher tactics. They also comment on the use of bail to increase penalties on protesters and how that was a positive sign and was likely to dissuade people.
Right.
They talk about meeting with Senator Joni Ernst's husband, I believe I'm saying that name correctly, in Iowa to try to use that office's political influence to crack down on protesters. So that was part of their job. Part of their job was to pressure law enforcement to be harsher. Part of the story there too is their ability, I think, to use psychological operations. Everything that we've gotten from TigerSwan that was shared with police harps on the presence of weapons in camps, the potential violence of people at the Standing Rock camps. One document I got from September 29th is an email from a TigerSwan, someone involved with the TigerSwan operation, to law enforcement warning of protesters inflicting violence on workers, which they claimed was information that they've gotten from an infiltrator. Mm-hmm. And they asked that information be passed on to the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security, which it seems like it was. So, you have this stunning ability for this contractor to push out information to law enforcement agencies that inevitably every time portrays the protesters in the most menacing light possible. And so if you're a police officer working this beat and you're reading this material from these guys who have experience waging the war on terrorism overseas and sort of have that military cachet, inevitably, if it were me, I might start to think differently about these people and start thinking about them, in terms of their potential to inflict violence and, maybe believe some of these claims about how they have weapons and are going to attack security workers and attack police. So inevitably that affected the response to the water protectors.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, in some cases, then they actually had what they called trusted agents that would infiltrate the situation
Right.
and try to stir up problems. And there have been some reports. I read a report today, I think, that may have been spawned by your reporting in The Intercept, that was talking about an incident where some cars were lit on fire, and they were discussing that maybe it was the guys from TigerSwan. I mean, are these, like the guy that you were talking about that busted into camp with this weapon? Are they becoming agent provocateurs? Are they planting, or creating a situation where violence is going to become an issue when it wouldn't before? And maybe if you can talk to this, but then also talk to, obviously this was a nonviolent action. Another thing that you mentioned in the article was that they had these agents in there searching for intelligence, and the worst thing they found was a pile of Earth First magazines, I thought that was kind of classic, especially being from Mendocino, where Earth First was so active in the 90s.
Right.
And so much of the emphasis, of course, is on nonviolent, action. And how do we protest politically in this nonviolent fashion? And I assume that there at Standing Rock, this was the goal, and that they were training to act in these nonviolent ways. When then we find out perhaps that there were these agent provocateurs sent in by TigerSwan that may have actually been ratcheting up the situation and trying to promote violence, in a sense creating the very situation that then they were using these psychological operations to try to say that this is what was going on, when in fact they were, the protesters are acting as nonviolently as possible.
Right. Well, I think there's a couple issues there. One is that, as you're saying, for the most part, people were committed to nonviolence. Just some of the ridiculous things, like finding an Earth First magazine, treating that as a threat, it characterizes just how inflated the estimate that TigerSwan is giving of the violent threat that these people posed. It's telling that in February there was this massive police operation to close the camps once and for all. Some of the people who are tuning into this will probably remember images of military-style police raids happening, driving the last campers out. The ATF, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, did a thorough inspection of the camps afterward. Found no weapons at all.
Wow.
And that tells you a lot about how credible these claims were. At the same time, there were people on the water protector side who got rowdy at times, and Jill Stein, for crying out loud, spray painted some machinery during her presidential campaign, and got charged for that by the state's attorneys for vandalizing equipment. So those sorts of things happen too. But to equate that with a terroristic threat to the national security of the United States, just because someone lights a barricade on fire, or somebody throws rocks at the police, or somebody does something to vandalize equipment, it's absurd to make the leap to say that these people are now a jihadist insurgency that threatens the national security of the country.
Right.
There's been, I think, steadily in recent years a move to sort of fuse the national security apparatus of the United States with private interests through this discourse of critical infrastructure. So since 9/11, there's been all these task forces and councils and things like that, where FBI and Department of Homeland Security people are sharing information with oil companies and other people who run so-called critical infrastructure, which the term critical infrastructure refers to installations that are basically important to the economy of the United States. And even pipelines that haven't even been constructed yet are being defined as critical infrastructure that is essential to the national security of the United States. So there's all these mechanisms that have formalized that way of dealing with protests that I think is part of the backdrop for this. For example, the Keystone XL pipeline, not as dramatic of a situation, not as big of a police response, but other journalists reported that the FBI had labeled the Keystone XL pipeline critical to the national security of the United States, and that's a direct quote. The Obama administration was still reviewing the permits for the thing.
Right.
These kind of operations are. I think my point there is that while this happened at Standing Rock, it didn't happen in isolation, and I think the reason TigerSwan, for example, is able to participate so heavily in these operations and has an opening for promoting protesters being terrorists is that that's a more broad trend that powerful institutions like the FBI and others are supporting at this point.
Well, I mean, that was, as I was reading the articles, one of the things that stood out was that you discuss, well, one thing you discussed along these lines is the use of they're actually called fusion centers, started in 2007, where all the different law enforcement agencies kind of work together, and I guess TigerSwan was working with these fusion centers now against the protests. But also another thing that kind of struck me was bringing in the anti-terrorism task force. I mean, I can only imagine if I was acting as a water protector involved in a nonviolent action, and suddenly the federal government is calling me a terrorist. I mean, that amps things up a little bit. That's when you're talking about these. Well, I mean, you get called a terrorist, and then they throw you in jail for the rest of your life. It's not just, you were involved in a nonviolent action, and you get, whatever. Maybe 6 months or a year or some kind of fine or something like that at the worst case scenario. I mean, so it really does, when the government and the corporations are working together and they're amping it up to calling you, jihadists, insurgents, terrorists, it's starting to get out of hand. And when you're just trying to we're talking about First Amendment rights, freedom of speech rights, really. I mean, my God.
Yeah, we're talking about protection of water. We're talking about climate change, which threatens everything, really. I mean, the United States does not have a policy to deal with climate change in a systematic way at this point. Mm-hmm. There's a hodgepodge of state laws and regulations that Obama put in place and things, but it doesn't amount to a coherent policy at all to deal with the problem on the scale that's needed. So, as a result, the U.S. is still building massive infrastructure to continue to burn petroleum and other fossil fuels. The Dakota Access Pipeline is a major example of that. If the United States were dealing seriously with climate change, the Dakota Access Pipeline would not have been built. So I think that's part of the backdrop for me in understanding the stakes of all this. If you, in the absence of a policy to deal with climate change, feel compelled, as a lot of people did, to engage in civil disobedience because you're concerned about the fate of future generations and the diversity of life on Earth, but then you get called a terrorist for doing that. I mean, that's a situation that is literally, it's literally antithetical to human existence and the existence of the biodiversity of the planet in the future. So the stakes are very large with this. I think that in the Trump administration, because it is so explicitly anti-climate change, so explicitly anti-social justice and racial justice. So not gonna address indigenous sovereignty claims, obviously.
Right.
Not that presidents have in the past, really either. But it's this kind of the stage is set for these kinds of things to continue. I don't think that people opposed to pipelines are backing down per se. I think that this repression has taken a big toll on on a lot of people, but there's the DAPL movement, the movement to stop this pipeline inspired people in an incredible way. There's all kinds of protests against other pipelines happening across the country right now. If Keystone XL actually starts moving forward, I imagine there will be very significant resistance to that. So, we're talking about things here. I think it's just important to underline that didn't happen in isolation. They're not going to go away. Certainly with the Trump administration in office, it's much less likely that they're going to go away than if like Hillary Clinton were in office or something. In a sense, probably a lot of other really horrible things would be happening if Hillary Clinton was in office. But,
Yeah.
Trump, with his level of unpopularity and his virulent anti-climate rhetoric and people realizing what it means if the United States does not deal with climate change, combined with just how inspired and active indigenous people are who are opposing these sorts of projects, means that these sorts of protests are going to continue, and the sort of security response we've seen in some form will inevitably meet them again until the issue is addressed meaningfully.
Yeah, I mean, you do talk about this in the third and fourth part of the series so far. I've got a couple of quotes here where in the TigerSwan documentation, after, I guess it was February 22nd, when they went in and they cleared the camp, they were still looking for work. They didn't want to be done.
Right.
So they were starting to talk about things like the anti-DAPL diaspora. And I have another one that's great, the dispersion of insurgency. And they were going back to Iraq again and being like, well, we know when we break these insurgencies up, then they just go back, into their homes, but they're still around and they're going to reform somewhere else. So we have to be on top of this. And they're still on the payroll, I guess, of Energy Transfer Partners, and they're working on these other pipelines. You talk about the Mariner East pipeline and the Atlantic Sunrise pipeline, and I think there's another pipeline that may be starting in New Orleans now, where TigerSwan is already on the ground running security. So they're definitely looking to the future to have this be kind of the standard operation.
Right. I think that TigerSwan considers what they did a success. I think Energy Transfer Partners probably views work as fairly successful. Obviously, if they're still on the payroll, that's the conclusion that is kind of obvious. So at least Energy Transfer Partners, which is one of the largest oil and gas corporations in the United States, and it's a Fortune 100 company, sees the work of this private mercenary corporation as a success. So they seem devoted to this sort of operation continuing if they are met with the same kind of resistance. And as you say, they are on the ground to some degree doing some things. Hard to say exactly what in Pennsylvania. They're at least doing the same sort of counter-information style campaign,
right,
to some extent in Louisiana, where the Bayou Bridge pipeline is being built. That pipeline would take some of the oil from the Dakota Access Pipeline and pipe it over to the Gulf Coast, the big export facilities and refineries there in Louisiana, Texas. So, that's a big project, and so it's not surprising to see TigerSwan involved to some degree there. It's something that I think is on the radar more now. And I think that both for oil companies looking at what worked and didn't work with the Dakota Access Pipeline, they're probably going to look at some of the things that happened. And I would imagine that certainly the counter-information part of it and that sort of thing, it's sort of standard operating procedure, I would venture to say, for a lot of companies already. But if you start seeing, private mercenary guys who are toting semi-automatic weapons and acting really aggressively at your pipeline protest, that's probably a pretty good indication that that the oil company that is involved there looked at the coax pipeline operation and decided that it worked well to to have this company TigerSwan repress pipeline protesters. And so that is something for us to be looking out for, I think, going into the future more and more.
Well, and this whole, I know there was also, you wrote a little bit about not just these controlling the narrative, this kind of psychological operation that the corporations are still, organizations like TigerSwan are going to be doing in communities where pipelines are coming, but also these trusted agents or these infiltrators coming in even to community meetings about stuff like this, and having their presence kind of secretly, covertly involved there, so that they're constantly gathering intelligence on Americans, in American communities who are just want to, have some say over what's going on in terms of the environment in their backyard where these pipelines are coming in. And there was one example where you were talking about like the pipelines going through, and they went to the judge, and the judge allowed them to arrest people on their own property if the pipeline was going through their property for trespassing on the easement.
Right.
And so maybe we're almost running into an hour, so we're getting towards the end. But there also seems to be a spate of anti-protest laws that are getting passed state by state all across the country. It seems like this corporate response probably to the No DAPL protests and others, the Keystone XL protests, where they're just going to start making it harder and harder and harder with harsher and harsher penalties to protest, even these nonviolent protests anywhere in the country.
Yeah, starting in North Dakota, there have been very similar laws passed in numerous states now. In North Dakota, they passed a law that makes it legal to run over a protester accidentally, quote unquote. Forbids people from wearing masks if they're gathered in groups of a certain size, and things that are just really clearly targeted at more, harsher criminalization of the kind of opposition that happened with the Dakota Access Pipeline. And similar bills in Oklahoma have passed. They've been introduced in a lot of other states. I don't actually know offhand where else they've actually been established and passed, but it's also something that converges with the anti-Trump resistance, where more and more often large crowds of people are going and doing rowdy things and protesting.
Yeah.
So, it's a variety of factors, but the overall effect is that there is this wave of anti-protest legislation happening across the country, and especially in the Midwest and some parts of the East and Southeast. So it's something to pay a lot of attention to. What I've observed with reporting on the Dakota Access Pipeline is that I think police felt frustrated with the tools at their disposal for prosecuting people for some of the things that they wanted to prosecute people for. So basically, they went out and looked for other things that they could criminalize. And even though they didn't really think they had the tools that they needed, they still prosecuted hundreds of people. So, things were already hard, for people trying to protest the Dakota Access Pipeline, and it's a matter of degrees worse with these bills.
And so what maybe can people do? I think one of the things I wanted to mention, almost our conversation's kind of come full circle. I mean, one of the things people can do is watch out for corporate propaganda on the internet, like be more discerning with your news, because, these corporations and private contractors like TigerSwan, who have these psychological operations skills, are going to be trying to control the narrative, make the protesters seem as violent as possible, and make the corporations out to be doing this great work for the people, even as they're annihilating the environment or ignoring, individual rights, or in the case of the Standing Rock, the tribal rights. So being more discerning about the news is something that people can do. Is there anything else? How do you stay informed about what's going on with Standing Rock? I mean, you can follow some of your work and some of your more recent articles in terms of where these prosecutions are going? Are there people that can be contacted? Are there organizations if somebody wants to help?
Hmm.
Where can people go to find out
Yeah.
more?
Yeah, I think that it's in a way a second phase of the struggle against the pipeline that now is focused on making sure people don't end up locked in prison for a long time who have been key activists in this struggle. The Water Protector Legal Collective is a very good organization that's doing good work. They have a website that people can find pretty readily. There's other organizations like that. The National Lawyers Guild is a part of defending protesters. I think that the main thing to keep in mind is that the prosecutions can create a major chilling effect on dissent in the U.S. if people see that the possible penalty is to get locked in prison for years and years. That's one aspect of it. But also, I think there's a very good tradition in the United States in many areas of supporting political prisoners, and just because someone is facing legal charges or in prison, they're still part of a movement, and I think a movement has a responsibility to see things that way and make sure that that person remains a part of the movement through continuing to give that person support, being in touch with them through writing letters or sending them books or whatever it may be. That's one other thing I would say people could do sort of on a personal level. Find out who these people are, find out what they're accused of, develop your own understanding of their situation, and maybe consider writing them letters or something like that. On a broader level, like you say, being discerning when you consume news and information is very important. But also, just I think that it's important to take a step back and realize that as we're talking about all this harsh repression against water protectors at Standing Rock, the movement itself has been incredibly successful in a lot of ways, and one product of that is all the other pipeline protests happening across the country. So if you're someone who is inspired by this movement or is a part of this movement, my main advice to you personally would be, look to ways that you can continue to take the spirit of what happened at Standing Rock and apply it to other things that you can be involved in, whether that's maybe another pipeline type of situation, or just working for social justice or working to protect the environment where you live, because the kinds of things that played out at Standing Rock fundamentally are not unique to Standing Rock. These sorts of things, whether it's threats to water, whether it's threats to racial justice issues, whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. There's the thing about there being so many problems in the world is that there's a lot of great work to do.
Right.
And coming together, in talking to people who are at Standing Rock who were a big part of the resistance there, their lives are changed in a really amazing way. A lot of people talk about this being the first time that they felt a sense of real community, real love, deep bonds of solidarity with fellow human beings that they'd never felt before. People are hungry for that, and
sure.
That's one of the things about engaging in these sorts of movements that people get, as a need that is fulfilled so often. So, I just want to sort of throw on that happy note. While there is a lot of repression and the stuff involving TigerSwan is daunting and sort of intimidating for a lot of people, it's also the case that there's this happy side to the overall story. If you sort of zoom out on it.
One of the themes that I have heard about from people that I know that went there to Standing Rock, they were just talking about how the overall theme of healing. I mean, if there was a spiritual component to all of this, the concept of becoming decolonized, but healing yourself on this kind of deeper level, so you have the strength to be able to stand up to some of these just really to anybody that's trying to push you around, right? It could be a big corporation, or it could be, the guy down the street that's a bully. But but there is like this healing component to it that I really appreciate it, and I hope that is the kind of thing that comes out of all of this, that more and more people start to wake up to and understand.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, we've got maybe the last couple of minutes here. You can say whatever closing statements you'd like to say, and just give some more information about the work that you're continuing to do. And if you want people to go, maybe some contact information or a website where people can go and find out more.
Yeah, my computer's actually about to die, so I should probably just say,
Perfect.
If you want to stay abreast of my work, I have a website, willparrishreports.com. I'm also on Twitter at willparrishca. It's an abbreviation for California, obviously, for anyone who, may happen to be reading into that more than they need to. So, you can follow my work there. We're going to be coming out with more stories with Intercept. I encourage people to go to theintercept.com to check them out. And really appreciate you having me on, Doug, and appreciate your work. I'm an old-time listener of KZYX.
Right on.
Yeah, it's an honor to be talking to you on your podcast, and I wish you the best with it.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I really appreciate you coming on and helping me out as well. This is only the second episode, so I'm trying to get this thing off the ground. And having said that, anyone who likes what they're hearing can check out The Shift. My Patreon page would be great. Just asking for a couple bucks a month to help me keep this going at patreon.com/The Shift. Or you can reach me on Facebook at The Shift with Doug McKenty, or Twitter at DMcKenty. So thanks everyone for listening, and thanks a lot, Will. Keep up the great work, and we'll talk again soon.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Doug.
You bet. Take care.
Okay, you too.